Welcome to part 1 of chapter 14, The Road to the Civil War. And in this episode, we'll be taking a look at some of the things that led to an increase in tensions throughout the United States in the 1850s. For it was during this decade that the problems of sectional balance kind of started to rear its head even more, as California petitioned for statehood, as Southerners, kind of began to threaten secession more and more, as we see federal laws like the fugitive slave law be at odds against state laws, the personal liberty laws. And all of this, which then brings us to the Compromise of 1850. It was Senator Henry Clay that proposed this compromise, which launched an emotional debate in Congress that continued for about 7 months. And it kind of all started when California's gold rush brought tens of hundreds of thousands of people to California looking to strike it rich. And so they petitioned for statehood. And under Clay's compromise, he proposed a little something for everybody. One, he proposes that California be admitted as a free state, which would give them actually more free states in the Union than slave states. Two, he also proposed that the slave trade in D.C. be abolished, but not slavery itself. And besides a couple other minor details as well, another one that he does propose to kind of appease the South a little bit was to propose a stricter fugitive slave law, one which required all citizens to try to return runaway slaves. And if they didn't help, they could be fined and thrown in jail. And being that members of Congress found parts of that compromise that they disagreed with, the chances weren't very good that it was going to pass. For even President Taylor was against the bill. But once he dies, President Millard Fillmore, the new president, would support it. And since the chances of it passing weren't very good, a young senator from Illinois, one Stephen Douglas, which we've mentioned before, helps get it through. And he does so by breaking it up into smaller, smaller bills. And then kind of encouraging some people to vote for the things you support, abstain from voting for the things you don't like, and eventually it does work its way through Congress. Even though members of Congress like John C. Calhoun from South Carolina spoke out against it. And many other congressmen found parts they didn't like. But eventually, this bill does get passed. And people kind of hope that this puts the question of slavery to rest. But really, it only postpones the arguments until a later time. And as we continue our look at other things that kind of led to more tensions during the 1850s, we have to mention Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, Stowe spent her childhood in Cincinnati, growing up on the banks of the Ohio River. And there she met former and fugitive slaves. In fact, after writing her famous book, it was President Lincoln that meets with her and says it's, this little lady that started this great Civil War. That's how influential her book was. And that book was Uncle Tom's Cabin. It changed how people saw slavery, as it showed slavery as the cruel and brutal institution that it was. And it was published in 1852 and sold over 300,000 copies in its first year and over 2 million in a decade. And it really brought slavery northwards, where many Northerners had never witnessed slavery. It really kind of exposed it and showed them how evil it was. Now, the South kind of thought it was, just packed full of lies and propaganda against slavery, and they spoke out and wrote out against it. And in fact, some Southerners even cut off fingers and ears of their slaves and sent them to Harriet Beecher Stowe herself. However, I should take a step back because slavery wasn't the only thing causing problems at this time. There were also issues dealing with immigration. And to kind of show us an example of this was the Know Nothings Party, which also becomes known as the American Party. Now, this becomes a prominent United States political party in the late 1840s and the early 1850s. It was kind of dominated by the middle and kind of working classes as they competed with jobs or for jobs with the immigrants that were coming to the nation. Now, what this party kind of stood for was kind of a pro-U.S. Stance. It was kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic stance. People feared Catholics coming to the nation because they thought that they might be more loyal to the Pope than to the U.S. And since many Irish and Germans coming here were Catholic, there was a backlash against them. So it's really kind of a nativist party, one that favored native-born Americans. And so that brings us to the election of 1852, where we see the Democrats nominate Franklin Pierce, the Whigs, General Winfield Scott, and the Free Soil Party, John Parker Hale. And as it turns out, the Democrat from New Hampshire, Pierce, will be a supporter of the stronger fugitive slave law of the Compromise of 1850, which eventually will create more opposition against him. However, General Winfield Scott, kind of loses this election partially because of his alignment with the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party. And as you can see here then, when you look at the electoral vote, it's kind of a hands-down easy victory for Pierce and the Democrats. But for how united it seemed like America was, in that election, with Pierce winning easily, in 1854, things will drastically change once the Kansas-Nebraska Act becomes debated in the halls of Congress. Something we'll take a closer look at in our next episode.